The world has gone mad, particularly over the last decade, but the roots of it go back a long way further. You want to know what's actually happening in the world? Don't read the public media. Use your own critical faculties, which is something that have been drummed out of us in the education system. You need to take the red pill to open your eyes to what's actually happening. And I've got a project starting off in Brisbane. There's one already going in Auckland for a red pill university, which will enable you to actually see what's happening in our world. Now, I want to ask you some questions. Do these things bother you and bewilder you? Well, the first one is cultural pessimism. Australian students thinking they go to learn and get taught how to hate their race, faith and heritage. And demonstrations which are anti-Australia Day. And people actually regarding the Australian flag as a symbol of racism. I took this photograph, reject white supremacy, hold cops accountable, outside a house in Melbourne, in Fitzroy North. And another picture here at Indooroopilly Shopping Centre in Brisbane. It's a large shopping centre. The centre management were actually running a display which included intermittently the words, "Say no to racism," as if we're all racist. A key ideologist in the development of cultural Marxism, which we'll be going on about, is Antonio Gramsci. And he talked about the need for a long march through the institutions to get rid of Christianity and all of the aspects of our culture that come from it. Another point is that what we see now is this concentration on gender fluidity and confusion, attacks on patriarchy and racism, noisy and overbearingly hostile minorities which have no respect for the majority of the population. And the rise now also of critical theory, which is full of leftist jargon, which is a completely perverted view of how the world works. Do you remember the Gillette toxic masculinity advertising campaign last year sometime, in which it characterised men as all potentially rapists? I, at least, and quite a few of my friends, decided then and there that we would never ever buy Gillette products again because it's such a rankling insult. Cultural Marxism pushes victim groups, gays, blacks, women, Muslims as alleged victims of racism and genocide, and now the environment. And you see also jargon, things like cisgendered, straight identified white men, pushed by radical feminists. We're seeing also the shutting down or even criminalising of free speech and language police for political correctness. Particularly in the universities, you're seeing attempts to shut down anybody whose views don't go along with the prevailing leftist narrative. Bettina Arndt, who's a conservative commentator, was demonstrated against when she was going to give a presentation at La Trobe University, and there was a rally against alleged sexism and bigotry. What rubbish! Gillian Triggs, the former president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, delivered herself of a real doozy when she said, "Sadly, you can say what you like around the kitchen table at home." Now, that's a voice of would-be totalitarianism. The left hate free speech by conservatives and tries to demonise and deplatform them. And so, you can be hung up by your arms if you say mankind in a university lecture instead of humankind. And in many universities and even some of the lefty schools, you get people who demand safe spaces where they don't have to hear things that supposedly hurt their feelings. We've got diversity fads which destroy effective military competence. And here's a picture from the Babylon Bee. In a push for diversity, military canine units to give equal opportunities to chihuahuas. Well, that's it in a nutshell. David Morrison, a former general in the Australian Defence Forces, said we need to shift our focus to those poor women trapped inside the body of a man and how we can change our military to suit Muslims. That's not exactly helping our military preparedness. Can you imagine Russia and China having women as their defence ministers? Men and women are different. They're wired differently. They have different approaches. But the EU is full of female defence ministers, and Australia had Maurice Payne. Peter Dutton is a much more effective Minister for Defence. And then we've got abuse of children by sexualising them far too young and teaching them gender fluidity through the Safe Schools program. And drag queens reading to small children in libraries. The Safe Schools program was pushed as an anti-bullying program, whereas it's nothing of the sort. It's basically social engineering of people into gayness and gender fluidity. The idea of drag queens giving presentations to small children really should be thin edge of the wedge. I complained to Brisbane City Council about them allowing this in our public libraries, and I got no useful response. But it is very subversive. It's child abuse. Another thing that should be consternating is the invasion of the West by incompatible aliens pushed by useful idiots as multiculturalism and diversity. And they say, oh, we don't have a culture of our own. Just throw in your own ink from wherever and you can call that Australian culture. Well, that completely denies and devalues everything that's gone before. Do you remember the Cronulla riots of December 2005? When a lot of, admittedly yobbos, but a lot of young Australian males took great exception to the trashing of our values by Lebanese Muslims. And then there was the Hyde Park riot in Sydney, where this hopeful held up a sign saying, "Behead those who insult Islam." Well, we're not really into beheading in Australia. That's completely incompatible with our culture, and it's extremely intolerant. And then we've had the Apex gangs in Melbourne, and violence from African immigrants. Thomas Sowell, the American intellectual, says Europe is belatedly discovering how unbelievably stupid it was to import millions of people from cultures that despise our values and which often promote hatred to the people that have let them in. Unfortunately, Britain and the EU haven't learned the lesson. They're still allowing thousands and thousands to come in. Many cities in Britain, especially in the Midlands, have been completely transformed and don't look like Britain anymore. And in Germany, you've had demonstrations by the locals against what they call rape refugees. And we've got massive corruption of the media in TV, radio and print, with fake news, slanted and selective, relentless leftist propaganda, attacks on Christianity, and, very insidious, censorship by big tech platforms in social media, where if Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or any of these things don't like what you've said, they'll deplatform you. Here's a perfect example of manipulation by the fake media. When President Trump was inaugurated in 2017, the picture on the right shows here the site that greeted him with thousands and thousands of people queued down the mall. The media chose to present a picture from the far end of the mall, purporting to show it almost half empty. That's colossal media manipulation. And the media have a great ability to be able to selectively pick things and present them with a wrong interpretation. I took this picture from my TV screen when Peter Hitchens the British conservative Christian, was one of the panelists on ABC Q&A. And I saw this flash up on the screen. One of the people had actually sent in from the viewers, "I'm an atheist, and yet even I'm sick of the continual Christian bashing here tonight on Q&A." Big tech calls them fact checkers. Facebook is full of this. Or we'll call them thought police. And then we've got the corruption of churches, interfaith gabfest with Islam, gay and lesbian ideology, and social justice given a completely unscriptural socialist interpretation. The Gosford Anglican Church, led by the so-called Venerable Rod Bower, has a tradition of putting up very political signs outside his church. How's this one? Jesus had two dads and he turned out okay. Well, that's supposedly pro-gay, but it's also extremely blasphemous. The Gordon Uniting Church is one of a whole number of uniting churches, and also, of course, Bower's own church in Gosford, of getting along the Grand Mufti to dispel Christian misconceptions about Islam. Let me ask you, how many mosques invite a Christian minister to disabuse Muslims of their misconceptions about Christianity? Too many of these progressive churches are into what they think of as cultural relevance, but it's destruction of the scriptural basis that should be their faith. And the socialists are pushing in the churches, with government all things are possible. And this is a paraphrase of, "I am the way, the truth and the life. No one comes unto the Father but by me. I am the equality, the diversity and the social justice. No one comes to the government except by political correctness." And then we have a continual narrative of impending catastrophe, climate emergency, global warming, all our fault. So let's go and destroy our economy. And we've been subjected to this sort of nonsense for decades and decades, and the climate is no different. Al Gore said 13 years ago, for nearly 14 years ago, the entire north polar ice cap will disappear in 5 years. Well, hello, there's more ice there now than there's been for a very long time. Extinction Rebellion are full of people who swallow this catastrophist narrative. But the fact is that people associated with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have recognised quite clearly that climate change policy is not environmental policy. It's about how we redistribute the world's wealth. A number of famous climate predictions in the past by Paul Ehrlich, talking about mass die-off from hunger. Al Gore from the world would turn into a total frying pan, and AOC, probably the most ridiculous member of the American Congress, says the world's going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. Greenpeace and other environmentalists in Australia have peddled the lie that coal mining is killing the Great Barrier Reef. It's absolutely not true. Greta Thunberg is a shockingly manipulated puppet of George Soros and of her parents. She rabbits on about how dare you. It's absolute garbage. Here are 3 books that I recommend that you have a look at and that you read. Brian Fagan is a professor in the University of California, and his thesis, which is very true, is that climate has warmed and cooled in cycles over a very long documented geological period. James Dellingpole, in his book Watermelons, reveals the money trail in the corruption of warmist science. And Michael Schellenberger, who is a mint grade genuine environmentalist, says that alarmism being currently peddled is hype not justified by evidence, and its policy prescriptions are frequently quite dangerous. Agenda 21 is a program of the UN about sustainable development, which sounds like a very laudable thing. But in practice, it seeks to bring all people in the world under the control of a narrow global elite. It puts nature above mankind and seeks to destroy human freedoms, making us all subservient to an engulfing one world government, in which there'd be an end of national sovereignty. So your rights and what you can do and can't do and how you can think could be just as much determined by people in Somalia or Sudan. Abolition of private property, restructure of the family unit, concentration of human beings into human settlement zones, and cutting down on irrigation, phasing out of meat, and so on. The coronavirus pandemic is engineered fear to justify ever more government control over our lives. You look at what we've put up with over the last 2 years, the destruction of freedoms and the rise of pervasive surveillance with check-in codes everywhere. That's state and federal. It's wonderful stuff. Cameras everywhere, exactly like China. And people are swallowing this need for more and more and more vaccines and boosters. So this young guy is on his way to get tested for the same illness I'm vaccinated against. Hello? Does that mean the vaccine doesn't work? In Australia, we've already been talking about a proposed cashless society, and thanks to Malcolm Roberts and the One Nation Party, that's been dropped. But a cashless society has very serious implications. If we don't have cash and you can't pay for things, and we have what can become a social credit card, the government can turn off your card and you are then completely locked out of the economy. You can't buy or sell. Vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, and it's already happening in Queensland and Victoria, where if you're not double vaccinated or can't prove it, you can't access all sorts of businesses. In Australia, all of our governing politicians have coordinated in a totalitarian coup against the civil liberties of our people. In Australia, as it was, we used to say, "Oh, no worries, mate." Now the ethic is, "Be worried. You are not safe. Trust the government to look after you." Those two pictures at the bottom I took at a freedom rally in Brisbane's City Botanical Gardens. There are a large number of people who are waking up to the malign agenda that's being pushed upon us here, but many more people need to wake up. And if you think a virus is scary, wait until you find out what's really going on. Is it a coincidence or is it a conspiracy that a lot of Western leaders are all using the expression "build back better"? Boris Johnson, Biden, Imran Khan, even in Pakistan, building back better, and Justin Trudeau in Canada. This is not something that they've individually thought of. It's a coordinated attack on life as we know it. The current tumble into a totalitarian nightmare over the COVID alleged pandemic is a coup, and likewise the climate emergency hysterical beat up. And what are the actual things that have happened during this period? There's been an enormous transfer of money to the elites. There's been a severe hurt of small businesses, the middle and working classes. How many small businesses have been forced to close down while, for example, Bunnings and Harvey Norman can stay open? And there's been a huge magnification of the power of governments over our lives. In my project for a Red Pill University, starting in Brisbane, and we've already got one in Auckland, and I hope it should go nationally, I've got a very comprehensive program in a curriculum, and there will be a series of videos covering the specifics in these topics. You can read those things. They're about culture war, what are Australian values? Islam, globalism, sustainable development, environmental catastrophism, corruption of education, the media, the judiciary, the human rights industry, the Aboriginal industry, corruption of the churches, de-Christianisation of the West, corruption of democracy, where political parties don't stand for who they say they do anymore, the rise of China and the massive threat that this proposes to us, and then finally COVID and the story behind the vaccines, the power and the economic clout of big pharma, the suppression of other medicines that can deal with these things, and the subjection of all of us to psychological operations and engineered fear, fake statistics, adverse effects of vaccine being suppressed, and compressing and creeping surveillance. The question is, in what has become a post-truth world, what are the real conspiracies?